All right. Welcome to another session of how to mix and master using Lapis Lazuli, my hit cover, I guess, as an example for y'all. So we're going to do bass today. I may toss in something else minor onto that because, to be honest with you, the way I do bass guitar is fairly straightforward. Although I may use today to go over the this fattener, quote unquote, uh, demo as well in order to do that. And then next I'll do drums. I want to make this clear too. I'm not doing any like compositional things, any arrangement ideas. This is all about mixing and mastering. If you want me to do arrangement ideas, you know where to post the comments in the comment section below. But for now, let's start with the bass guitar. So first of all, let me undo. Oh, okay, cool. It's already undone. Is that so I go on the compressor there. So that doesn't sound terribly impressive, admittedly, but I mean it's bass, so it's supposed to fill out a certain frequency set. So let me get to the chorus. So this is the bass tone by itself. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I think a lot of people think the bass should sound more like, I think the bass should sound more like, I don't know, oh, God, no. Like this or something. Like really, really thin. But I prefer to have it where, you know, you got that little clankiness. Not a lot, but just enough so that it cuts through everything else. Because otherwise, like, oh, that's loud. Let me let me do this. So what I did there, by the way, was I basically showed you the difference between the raw signal and the signal if I were to not have any like high-end frequencies on there. As you probably can recall, we always have a high pass going, or rather a low cut. Wow, a low pass or a high cut going on a lot of our instruments. Bass is no exception. But I was showing you the difference between if I just didn't have it, period, and then if like what some people think a good bass tone should be, which is to me incorrect. At least for this style. I mean, if you're trying to do like a Beatles cover band, don't listen to me. But if you're doing something like 80s rocks, like this sort of thing, don't destroy your the higher levels of your bass tone. So let me show you what this sounds like. All right, so do you hear? And let me maybe turn it up a little bit here. But do you hear how like the bass you can definitely still hear-ish the low end of it, but you also are getting some clarity so you can hear what notes the bass are playing? Well, that's what we're after. If you reduce that, like it's still there, but the problem you run into is for stuff like this section, it sort of gets lost in my opinion. I don't know. It's a preference thing. Being a bass player myself, I prefer to have a little bit of that high end in there because it really just helps stuff like this part here. Let's see. Bomb, bomb, bomb. Where I'm playing something a little different. But if like, see, you just have to turn up the bass more if you had the really round tone. But same rules for the guitar. I mean, the bass doesn't really need a lot of high end unless you're doing something super bass centric. In which case, I mean, if you're making a sound like the Star and it's only a single sound and not being layered at all, really good thing to do is just to have like it take up as much frequency space as possible. So I wanted to talk about the high end first of the bass because obviously most people start with the low end of the bass, which is a big deal, but it's also the bulk of what we're going to talk about going forward now too. So again, that high end tone, like having enough of that high end there just allows it to cut through a little bit more, especially through thick things like it allows you not to have to turn it up too much. And again, I'm not really doing too much boost. I mean, if you can see here, I mean, this is like really subtle EQs. Why? Well, here's the thing. The fact is, like, my bass tone without this addition, although let me see if I can just turn off the EQ itself. Yeah. Oh, that turns off the effects chain too. Let me do this. All right, cool. So if I turned off that, I mean, the fact is my bass tone cuts through pretty well anyway. So it doesn't really need a lot. Like, this is just for other reasons. So like, most of the time you do not need any frequencies below 20 hertz because human beings can't hear it, but computers can calculate it, so it still contributes to the overall sound coming out. So when you're doing your mastering or your final mixing, it can really add extra frequencies that you don't need, which can really muddy up a mix. So my advice is to, even if you have, depending on your recording, check using an analyzer of some kind, because let me just go back to here and then I can show you an analyzer here. Check an analyzer of some kind. Most of the time, I mean, if you need to go to kvraudio.com and download one, that's fine. I know for a fact you can go to ikmultimedia.com and get one. But basically, if you're seeing a lot of stuff going on around here when you're looking at it, because basically an analyzer just shows you what frequencies are present. If you see a lot going on down here, do the little bit of the cut. If you don't, because sometimes like my old bass setup used to not really have too much of that for whatever reason, which is why I switched. Well, part of the reason why I switched anyway, to what I record with now, is so you want some of this, because this is where a lot of energy in a mix comes from. And if you're listening to any sort of larger speaker setup other than earbuds, realistically, or like really crappy headphones, you get a big you get a lot of energy from this area. So let's talk about this area a little bit. The realistic thing is, it might be tempting to just go like have this off and then just go, oh, look at that, listen to that bass. But that's just excessive. And your mix won't be as loud, and for metal it just overtakes everything. Use some caution. I mean, and even if you did this, it kind of sounds cool, but realistically, if you put that on a bigger sound system, or if you're listening to it on a bigger sound system and I'm showing you that example, it will be ridiculous. So you don't need to do that. I mean, if you're really trying to make up for the lack of something that you have in your original recorded signal, which you should always just try to get as clean a signal as possible. I mean, I have some grit on mine, but that's because my setup allows for it. I like to have a little bit of distortion in my bass tone, but that's just for this style. Obviously, other styles I have a cleaner tone, so no worries. But that doesn't, I mean, this is all about frequencies, really, because you should be able to work with any bass tone and see if it has the frequencies you need, and boost is needed. I, obviously, for this one, don't need a lot, because you can hear that low end anyway. So I'm just having a little bit of a boost here, because in order to get out of the way of the chugging guitars, I cut at around 200, 2 to 300 hertz, because the chugging of the guitars, some of the kick drum, and a lot of other things compete for this space. And you don't want the bass guitar taking up too much of that, because it's kind of got this own place to live. Like, the only things that should be in this area really are bass guitar, maybe some other bass instruments, and the bass drum. So the kick drum, or as we call it. So you really don't want too much happening down here, because this is where the bass carries, and this is where some of the character comes from I'm sorry, this is where some of the character comes from on a bass guitar, and it's around 2,000 hertz, a little under that, and that's where you get some of that bite to it. And again, you don't really want too much. My tone just naturally has a lot of bite, but if you're trying to kind of get it to cut through a little bit more, as we've been talking about, really around 2,000 hertz is where you want. So that's another thing. I use a quite good bit of compression on bass. So let me just add another window here. Window capture, add, and then we'll do this. Boop. So you can see this here. I may make it a little bigger for you real quick. So there's a lot of knobs going on here, but basically you can start from a preset if you'd like. Otherwise, note this. While it's playing, the gain reduction isn't really going past 2, meaning it's not really adjusting the sound by much more than 2 decibels. And you don't, because if you have any more than that, it sounds gross. And if you have too little than that, you might as well not have a compressor, generally speaking. There is some advanced tech with certain vintage models like this one is, where the compressor changes the sound in other ways. But if you don't have that, what I would suggest is a relatively quick attack, moderately high release, and just basically aim to have the gain reduction end up being between 1 and 2 decibels when you're using compression on bass. So, there's that. So that's basically that's the big one with that, in my opinion. So there you are. That's that one. Looks like I like to make these about 15 minutes long, so this is good. So that's really all you need to know for bass to start with. There's couple more bits of tech, because as mentioned, you may not be able to do this, but there's 2 bits of tech you can do. If you can do a side chain, if you can make a bus, as we mentioned earlier with reverb, you can do it with a compressor, and basically you get a compressor. And oh, hey, that's interesting looking. Will you not do that? Thank you. Okay, so if you have something, it doesn't matter, but basically, I need to route that through. So basically, there's 2 ways you can do it. I like to have it so that it's basically reducing as much as possible, because the whole idea behind this is you're just compressing the living F out of just the snare, the kick, and the bass, and it adds a little bit of punch. And if you look down here, you'll notice that it's not really a lot into the recording. So you basically are just like, you're basically on solo. Okay, that sounds good. Chug, 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 chug. And then you're like, oh, hey, that adds a lot more. There's a lot more of that. It just adds a little bit of extra punch to the bass, and it helps it so you don't try to get too much out of the one bass sound. It's a sort of like a layering technique, if you want to think of it that way. You're basically taking the basic signal from all 3 of these, shoving them through a compressed hose, and then just having that as a little bit of an extra thing to punch up, so that just adds that little extra bit. Is that required? No. I mean, as you can hear, it sounds pretty good without it, but it just adds that little extra bit. And again, it's supposed to be subtle, so don't overdo it. Don't go too crazy with it, but it just adds a lot of flavor. And you can use any compressor. If you have one that emulates the Black 76 limiting amplifier, as you saw earlier, that's cool. If you don't worry. Last thing is, before I let you go here, is that you can basically put a compressor on the bass. And then if you have a compressor that does this, I only ever use the one that's native to Sonar, but you can basically have it so that let me see if I can. Yeah, you basically have it so the kick drum punches through the bass and it compresses it. So like, It just basically helps it so the kick drum sticks out a tiny bit more. It's not, well, again, required, but for something that's really dense and heavy like this, it's my preferred method. So basically what you do is you set it up to this compressor here, and boop. This compressor, set it up so that you basically have 0, 1, and like, basically what you're aiming for is, basically what you're aiming for is about 6 decibels of gain reduction when the kick is really hitting hard. It's just another way to even it out a little bit without taking too much away from everything else. So, I don't know. There's a lot that goes into it, but basically, really quick, like the most intense compressor of your life, and basically have it so that you're sending the kick drum through it via the same way you would send it through a bus. And that's it. That's how you sidechain. So I can't believe I just spent 15 minutes on literally one instrument. But the thing about bass that's easy to do is basically be careful of having too much sub low end, because if you don't have that in control, your mix will sound gross and muddy and won't be able to be like it's quote unquote loud as others. And this is, again, just for rock and metal. If you're doing a different style, obviously sometimes you just want a lot more sub bass, but you really still need to make sure that that low end's in control, because if you have too much going on down there and or you have too much of one frequency, etc., it'll sound like ass. It'll sound awful. So that's it for this week. I will definitely see you on the flip side, and I hope you all have a great day, Wolfpack, and I can't wait to see the 7,000 subscriber special that's coming up soon.